welcome back. This is Doug Wheeler. This is From the Belly. Where did that name come from? That name came out of the writing of my book, Reimagining Jonah, that came out in November of 2023. And I just saw essentially everything happening to Jonah. It all gets kind of centralized around what happens to him in the womb of the great female fish that I named the she-fish, because we think of a whale. So many things about that story have been misrepresented. That's where the name comes from. Today, I have two individuals that I sought out about a week and a half ago. My process of selecting a guest or guests has always been on the fly. It's like, oh, I want to talk to this person. Oh, I want to talk to that person. This came to me differently. This came to me as I have to talk to somebody about this topic of what's coming in January with Trump's second presidency. I call it the 4 years of Trump ideology. I selected two people who I want them to talk to me and to us about it from a Christian place. And something about that, I initially cringe, because to me, it can so limit the message. The reason I chose Marty Folsom and Craig Keene is because they're going to talk to us about Karl Barth. They're going to talk to us about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And those are messages that are proven to be for the world at large, not just for the church. I, in my mind, imagine the church having a message for the world, as opposed to the church having a message for itself. I've kind of outgrown that small world. Does the church bring something for the world? And I believe Barth and Bonhoeffer did, and they lived it. Marty and Craig, thank you for being here. So Marty and Craig tell you who they are and why they wanted to do this in the first place. I'm going to start with Marty Folsom. Marty, if you would tell us a bit about your bio, and then tell us why you said yes to my invite to talk about this.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am a theologian, which often people think theologians are people who talk about God. My biggest concern in life is to let God talk. We get in the way so much. And so my story really goes back, even when I was a kid, to thinking of Christianity as a place where you go and sit and listen a lot, and then you're supposed to follow a set of rules and impulses, and all of it kind of lived in the head. So one day I became aware that there was something beyond just the rational, and that is the relational. My pursuit in education has been to understand, how do we hear the basic heart motive of Christianity to be about the transformation of the heart, because a living God comes, speaks to us, takes our heart, transforms it, invites us into a way of participating that is life transforming. My doctoral work engaged Karl Barth primarily on the question of what does it mean to be persons, and particularly free persons. I also worked with John McMurray and John Zazoulis, a Scottish philosopher and a Eastern Orthodox theologian who also dealt with the nature of person and freedom. But all three of them felt like, to be a person, the word freedom is the fullest sense of what that looks like. And so I've been teaching in a variety of schools, from Seattle University, Jesuit school, to Trinity Lutheran, to Northwest University, a diversity of schools that have shaped in me a concern for the whole of the Christian community, and to be somebody who builds bridges between the churches as well as the academy and the church. And so the nature of what I do now is largely right. I'm doing a 5-volume series on Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics for Everyone, which not only engages the dogmatics in a Rick Steves tour guide kind of way, but also engages conversation with other disciplines, science, the arts, mental health. I'm wanting to really expand the conversation, because I think Barth begins that bigger conversation. I am a theologian who's committed to being loving and nurturing all my relationships, so I do therapy as well, and that can be at the level of couples or individuals, the mostly couples and families, but also churches, and also thinking at the level of culture. And so your invitation is to ask a question: how do we recognize the nature of something that Barth recognized about the disorder of culture, and the question of what is the place of the Christian church being Christian in a way that Barth envisioned, that is a callback to something where the word health might actually be used in an appropriate kind of way. We talk today about spiritual health and mental health, but mostly we talk about disorders. And it's easy to just talk about the disorders of what we're facing in a few weeks without having a sense of what would orderliness look like, and how does the orderliness then make clearer the problems of those disorderly elements that are there. It was really invitational for me because it means we're listening to somebody who actually lived through not just the Hitler time. Kaiser Wilhelm was another of the same kind of confrontation by ideologies that were calling everything Christian into question, and yet the church was seduced by it. To echo Barth's life in the political world as it came into being, the nature of asking the question, what does it mean for the church to be the church and not to merely collapse into being an echo of either politics or economic driven ways of thinking and functioning, is really aligning with what it is that I have learned from Barth in a way that speaks to our current context.
Beautiful. Thank you, Marty.
I suppose it's my turn.
It is, Craig.
I'm an old guy. 70. I had my 75th birthday a couple of months ago. Am retired. I was a professor of philosophy and theology for 38 years at a series of institutions, the first three of which were denominational universities. I am an Okie, born at St. Anthony's Hospital in Oklahoma City, and I stumbled my way into the Church of the Nazarene when we moved to Chicago when I was about 8. And I remained in the Church of the Nazarene. The rest, still am a member, an ordained deacon in the Church of the Nazarene. I am told I am not a very good sort of representative of the Church of the Nazarene, but I'll let others make that judgment. It is where I live. Stumbled my way not only into the Church of the Nazarene, but also into theology, finding my way there in the late 60s and early 70s when I was confronted by the harsh reality of the Vietnam War, which was in the face of virtually every American over and over again every day. Newspapers, magazines, television, evening news, but elsewhere. And I found myself, engaged in a very naive reading of the book of Acts, naive, but nonetheless intense reading of the book of Acts, asking myself not what would Jesus do, but what would like Stephen do or Paul do? And coming from a very conservative background, my father, a veteran of World War II, I found myself very seriously considering whether I, as a Stephen wannabe, could put myself under the authority of America and America's military and put my body in South Vietnam. And I concluded that I could not, that the gospel called me to a kind of nonviolence, something like pacifism. I wish there were words shalomism, but that's where I found myself. And all of my theological work from that point forward went through that question. What would Stephen do? The question, how do I think? How do I act? How do I work otherwise than according to the dictates of a very violent world? My doctoral dissertation is on Karl Barth and Wolfhart Pannenberg, a Swiss and a German theologian, both Germanic. My interests are quite broad, and I have found those two theologians to be very helpful guides as I have continued to try to figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
I want to let the audience in on how I presented this to the two of you. I simply said, how do we prepare ourselves? We being just people in general, if we're talking specifically about one persuasion of faith, the Christian faith, the Christian church, knowing that means a lot. What does that mean, the church? With all these varied, right? Just like saying the Bible, it's like, okay, how many interpretations and then how many interpretations of that interpretation? But we'll work from the consensus of a place that gathers around the place of God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and the Bible having a place in that space. How does how does a Christian, how does the church inform the world? How do the two of you represent what you believe and what you believe Barth and Bonhoeffer brought to the cataclysmic situation that they found themselves in? Many are saying that that's what's coming for us, some variation of that. We don't know yet. Something that really got my attention a few weeks ago was an individual who is a conservative Republican commentator who actually this time around did not vote for Trump. I'd never heard of the individual before, done a little bit of research on him, like I always do, about who's this person and what's their background and where are they coming from. He said there's never been a fascist campaign that didn't turn out to be a fascist government. That the transition is, if that's what it's built on and campaigned on, then that's what it's going to become. And so that got my attention with something that I already was concerned about what's coming. And I think we see the building of that. But I posed it to the two of you, and this is what got your interest, I think. I just said, there's a shit show coming starting in January. It's kind of this weird lull right now, like the eye of the storm is the way I'm feeling it, but it's coming. I don't think it's what I feel, as in what I hear, ain't going to be good for many, many people. And we can talk about those demographics of people that are going to suffer greatly. Other people, they'll find success in what takes place. But I find no better way to say it's a shit show coming. So what can we learn via Barth and Bonhoeffer about what to do in the midst of that? Because the word resistance is a word that I want to embrace, but I don't want to do it recklessly. I don't want to do it foolishly. And I sure don't want to just kind of feed that monster of, just fight back in any ugly way that you can. What does resistance mean to these two individuals? And what does resistance mean to the two of you in light of what's coming?
Well, I think the resistance is the right word. And if we hear it a certain way, it's a profoundly theological term. I mean, the etymology of the word resist is almost identical. I mean, they're different families, but they say primally the same thing: to resist, to resurrect. Resistance is a resurrection. Both are to stand up. And of course, there are various ways of standing up. I think the theological task, the task of the church, is to find out how to stand up in this current situation. My tendency is not to say shit show, but shit storm is coming. But on the other hand, I'm not a good predictor of the future. I do think Donald Trump plans to keep his promises. Whether he will have enough discipline to do so is another question, but the persons he is putting forward to occupy significant roles in his government indicate that he's wanting to keep his promises. On the other hand, it is also our task, even in the face of events that seem to be coming that will call into question our hope, it is still our task to hope. And Donald Trump got a majority of the votes cast. And there are a lot of people who look to him to be the source of an improvement of their lives. And I do hope that people who are suffering and see him as a way out of that suffering will, in fact, be benefited by his presidency. I mean, all you have to do is think of the oxycodone epidemic and the massive number of deaths by opioid overdose to know that in a certain part of America, there is enormous pain. And just as I would say that suicide statistics are a good guide in recognizing that queer people need our advocacy, it's also a good guide in showing that a great number of people in rural America need our advocacy too. So I don't want to dismiss those concerns. But in all of Donald Trump's rhetoric and his record from last time, all of that shows that he plans to shove aside as much as possible the most vulnerable people in our world, within the borders of the U.S., but also outside the border of the U.S. He seems to have a kind of survival of the fittest mentality. I don't think it's well thought out, but I do think he sees the world as a place where you have to fight, you have to be tough, you have to defeat your enemies, you have to roll over anyone in your way. And at the end of the day, the best people are the strong people, the people who stand in the face of adversity and are able to capitalize on it. And so I think we should, if not expect, I think we should realistically fear that once more there will be child separation from migrant parents. We should expect that those currently living in the U.S., whether legally or not, who do not have citizenship, will be facing hardship because of the policies of the Trump administration. I think we should expect that the people living on streets, the unhoused, will be treated badly by the Trump administration. And though, as one of Donald Trump's relatives said, Trump isn't so much a racist as a sort of equal opportunity user. He will use anyone to get to where he wants to go. And I believe that to be true. I would be very happy to be shown that I'm wrong in that, but I believe it to be true. And so, whatever it takes for Trump to gain power and increase his wealth, I think is going to happen. That should make every person who is responsive to the gospel stand up and demand that we not take this stuff lightly, but that we recognize that the gospel calls us to stand up in the face of that onslaught against the poor of this world.
Marty, what are your thoughts as you listen to Craig?
Well, the really practical things that you brought out. Thinking from Karl Barth, the word resistance always has to be preceded by the yes. The yes always precedes the no for Barth. And so when he begins his Barmen confession, Jesus Christ, as he's attested for us in Scripture, is the one word of God which we have to hear and which we have to trust and obey in life and death. And it doesn't say it there, but and not Hitler.
Yeah.
Right? You have to say there's a voice we're supposed to be listening to. And so to say we're in a lull point in the middle is to say the work that has been done over the last decade, maybe, to divide this country around the ideologies of division that seek self-interest at virtually every level, to the point that somebody worried about the price of eggs and milk overrides the concern for how we treat people who come from virtually any ethnic community outside, and to literally give them no value in asking how do we provide ways for them to appropriately cross borders and to acknowledge the role they play in the very structure of a nation where we serve them as they serve us, which is gospel type stuff. So Barth wants us to begin with a vision of the gospel is yes. And it calls us then to say no to things that stand contradictory to that. One of the things that Barth, quite clearly stood against in Volume 2 on election, Barth's quite controversial in some ways in election, but he said, Jesus is the elected one. And if we elect a human person to be the one who replaces Jesus and give them the power, which he's talking about Hitler in this place, we have created a monster. We've created something that no longer respects the proper one to follow, and we will be led by somebody who will replace it with all kinds of other things, which includes, instead of the church, which you mentioned the church, we will have an elect community, and it will be a nation. We are the chosen ones of God. And he saw that happening in Nazi Germany at that point. So you have a new elect leader instead of Jesus, the Führer, which can mean Lord. You have a new Lord in Hitler. You have a new elect community that's not the church. It's a people who are only interested in themselves and their power. And these are things to which we need to say no, because we know what yes looks like. And we need to say no to these things that would usurp, destroy, divide, and then all the implications of how one looks at, in this case, the Jews, and decides that they are, not worthy to live, basically. And so one then has power over life and death. And so the question of, thou shalt not kill. Well, who does that include? Pretty much everyone, except he does say there is a point, it's tyrannicide, where there is a tyrannical person who is so devastating, maybe to the universe, maybe to the earth, maybe to a huge, vast number of people, where there is a justified sense that this person dying, it's justified for them to die. He was thinking in the first sense maybe of Hitler, but also recognizing Jesus died on behalf of the many too. So he doesn't depart from Christological thinking. There is a point where death may make a point, but we do need to recognize that we are pacifists to the degree that we can be. But on his other Black Day in 19, when he saw 19 of his professors marching in support of Kaiser Wilhelm's war policy, which was a move to nationalism. We as a nation are superior, etc. It's the basis under which people hand over their rights to a individual who claims to have a power to make it better for them. But they have to sacrifice their theological, their servant responsibilities, all those things. So he became profoundly disillusioned on that day. It's called Barth's Black Day, because he saw that those who were doing theology gave up their allegiance to the living person of Christ, who is for the good of humanity, who sacrifices and serves, and that they turned to basically worship, meaning of greatest worth to them was their own self-interest, to have somebody who promised to give them power and status in the world, and they bought it hook, line, and sinker. So much more overt with the nature of the clearly fascist schemes that have been seen with Mussolini, are echoed in Stalin, and it was just not going well in the world. But the nature of just a loss of a sense of humanity that prioritizes self-interest, so to say, individualism is the virus of our time. And the looking at, isn't it better for you today than it was, or wasn't it better 4 years ago than it is today? And for people to say yes to it without really thinking what that would mean and only looking at the cost of a gallon of gas and a gallon of milk and those things. The self-interest is the move of lack of concern for the other, for God, only concern for the self. And if you put loving self before those other things, you never get to love of God and you never get to love of neighbor. The self literally takes over. And so it is a last verse of the book of Judges, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes kind of moment. So the division isn't just red and blue. It's much, much deeper. So the level of Barth's critique is going to go at every level, theologically, culturally, politically, and economically as well, that in every case, Jesus is the Lord. And we have to say no to those things that attempt to take the place of it, because it's just an attempt to build the Tower of Babel. You're attempting to build your own way to get to some kind of a heavenly position with power and authority, with a divine covering, but with none of the acknowledgement of the nature of the God who would call us to be a humanity who cares for the outcast. You just think about Jesus' sermon from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. To do what? Bind up brokenhearted, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. He goes on with all the things that would be the opposite of the form of government structure that seems to be what we're looking at. If you just ask the question, what fruit of the Spirit does Donald Trump seem to put out there? Is there any sense in which he is guided by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control? Do any one of those, which would be called for as a leader, and Karl Barth said in Romans, follow your leaders, but only insofar as they are serving the one who is the proper Lord of humanity and the Lord of the church. And so if none of those are present, then it's like, we are not called to serve somebody. We come to you not because we're political advocates. We just know the one that made this all, holds it all together, and you are destroying it. And so we have to hold out what the truth is, so that the lies can be seen as lies because of the nature of knowing the truth. We've lost our capacity for truth. I mean, whether it's the media or whatever, we don't know who to trust anywhere anymore, it seems. Truth is at stake here, along with individualism. How do we regain the ability to say something true?
I want to go back to Bart's Black Day. He, with these 19 other professors,
Yep.
so did he stand alone in resistance? Did he have anybody else standing with him? What was that period of time like for him in regards to, if we stick with this theological term, as Craig told us, what did he resurrect? What did he use, and what did it cost him?
Barth writes about that Black Day. I mean, he opened the newspaper and saw basically a full-page ad in support of the German war effort, signed by virtually every one of his former professors. A full-throated affirmation of German nationalism. And he just felt gutted. He felt that if his teachers, I think it was all but one of his former teachers had signed this thing, that if they could support such nationalism, let's call it Christian nationalism, then that meant that their theologies were bankrupt, which means that virtually everything he had learned from them was rendered null and void. And he was pastoring at the time in a little Swiss Reformed church in the city of Sophenville, an industrial city, a small city, and he found himself all of a sudden not knowing what to say when he rose into the pulpit on Sunday, because all of his theology had been destroyed. And he slowly worked his way back, largely by a close reading of the book of Romans, which resulted eventually in the first edition of his epistle to the Romans, a kind of a free-form commentary, and then a radical revision of that book in its second edition, the epistle to the Romans. Still one of the most powerful theological treatises ever. I mean, it's not the go-to place if you want to know what Karl Barth thought during World War II and after, but he never uh, denied what he wrote in that book, and I think it still needs to inform us. What Barth did, what he came to do after that revelation, was draw close to other theologians who found their way similarly out of the darkness. Terneisen was a close friend of his, and he had conversations with him immediately. He would ride his bicycle 20 miles or something to a nearby town, and the two of them would have conversations over coffee or beer and cigars about what are they going to do. He read a lot of Dostoevsky then. Kierkegaard became important for him. Nietzsche, I think, took on a different shape. He heard something in Nietzsche that was helpful to him as well. And then he found himself drawing close to others, including Rudolf Bultmann and Paul Tillich and Friedrich Gogarten, and they came to be known in the East as the dialectic theologians or dialectical theologians. Publishing a number of works in a journal they published called Between the Times. Is a marvelous series of publications from that journal. What happened was that Barth and the others believed that their world had been destroyed. It had been rendered to dust and ashes. And they found that the only way out of that darkness was to be resurrected by the grace and mercy of God. And so in this period, Marty, you spoke a little bit a few minutes ago about the no and the yes of God. In this period, a period, though much of it occurred in the aftermath of the First World War, a time of desperation, I think the seeds of this kind of theology were sown in reaction to a highly optimistic view of the world. And so maybe the most important of Barth's teachers, Adolf von Harnack, had been, in fact, a ghostwriter for the German Kaiser. He wrote one of the Kaiser's speeches. Now, this is an enormously important figure. Harnack read in multiple translations around the world. God was unbelievably important. But these people supported Germany to the point that they believed that it is the duty of German citizens not only to die, but to kill and kill with abandon in order to exalt the nation state. What Barth came to eventually, in a time of increasing desperation, was, as you said, Marty, to kind of reverse the order of the no and the yes. But that has everything to do with the situation he found himself in. There is both a no and a yes in Barth, and the order depends on the times. And in our time, it seems to me that there is a rousing no to be declared, to be echoed, the no of God to be echoed against those who think that America is our salvation, the salvation of anyone. No, the no of God is to be heard. But to those who are kicked into the ditch, who are shoved aside for the sake of the progress of a certain ideal forged in America by white supremacy, those who are shoved aside, whose lives are ruined, those whose children are separated from them, those who must grow up never knowing their parents. To those people, the yes of God is to be spoken until they hear it. And I think it is the task of the church, and we probably need to talk about the whole religionless before we're done. It is the task of the church to put the bodies of its members in utter solidarity with the oppressed, as the yes of God is spoken there and the no of God is spoken against those who would crush them even more.
And I would only say the yes never goes away,
Oh.
but sometimes it compels us to say no. to say the Epistle of the Romans begins with the yes of God, the gospel of God. Then it gets to the point where it says that God has said no to these things and everyone falls under it. Therefore, God had to do something to get us out of it. But to say every yes that we ever have always implies a no, and every no always implies a yes. So people didn't realize when they said yes to Trump, all the things they were saying no to in terms of just caring for the basic structures. And so people don't know the difference between fascism and social democracy, and therefore they don't know what to say yes or no to because they've never seen anybody define it or manifest it in a way they can say, oh, I don't want to lose that. That's what I'm doing. And so they buy the lie.
I want to add just one little thing that I want to hear more of what you have to say about that. But I'm a little afraid that the way I put it made it sound like you can kind of make a list of those things that God says yes to, and you can make another list of those things that God says no to. It is more radical than that. In both the epistles of the Romans and the later volumes of Barth's Church Dogmatic, the no and the yes of God are absolute. Both of them are. In fact, I say that perhaps the way to put it, and again, the emphasis depends on the theological situation that one is working in, that the no of God is so radical, so utterly devastating that it becomes a yes. And so, in other words, if we look, and this needs to be nuanced in ways that I can't nuance it right now in a couple of seconds. The crucifixion of Jesus. I mean, Jesus is in the place of the no of God. The no of God carries Jesus to the cross to utter annihilation. But that no blossomed into a yes that is every bit as radical and pervasive.
I would just flip it around and say, God demonstrates his love for us in that while we are yet sinners, Christ dies for us. The love of God is what sends him to the cross. So the yes of God is what precedes the no, and the cross shows what our inhumanity does to the yes of God in God's love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The yes means that he sends the Son to say no to humanity's inhumanity and call us to a life that doesn't live with ideals, nationalisms, abstractions of what a perfect nation looks like, that replace the living God who calls us to live historically with the neighbor that's next to us and the one that we meet at the border, and to say the yes of God has said yes to you. We may need to say no to you when you come to do pillage and harm, but we're not going to assume that. We're going to assume the yes of God and ask, how can we be a neighbor to you? And then to act out the yes and say no to those who would simply caricaturize them with big words that cloud the actuality that's there. So for Barth, the actuality of who we're talking about matters incredibly. Idealisms and all those things of nation or groups of people, that's really what natural theology is against. You're reading from your natural instinct, oh, they must be a threat, or oh, we must be better than them. Manifest destiny. God gave us this land and we can eliminate anybody that gets in our way because God gave it to us. Like, whoa, just a minute. You've taken a big idea, slapped it on God's face, and then gone out and slaughtered in the name of it. None of this was actual or proceeding with the yes of God. It was all self-serving, and it could not see the other as human or person, and therefore animals to be eliminated. So natural theology is we can't think from the human and human sensibilities or we're going to get in trouble. And that's what Harnack was doing, rewriting German history so that it led to the nature of God creating the Germans as the ideal that, of course, Hitler said, of course we're the ideal. This is what God made us to be, right? And so when they went out to war, God is with us is what it read over the banners as they went out to march. God is with us. Well, what God? The one that was created by humans who usurped the place of God, put his name out there to lead the way. But there's nothing much closer than I can get if you've been watching the Rings of Power. Sauron is the perfect image of the ability to appear as an angel of power and light, but who lies and causes people to think in ways that are different at every point where they end up destroying each other. And in the end, only he is left standing. And this is Tolkien writing when? Right out of World War II. He had all of the same intuitions that really informed The Lord of the Rings. So I mean, we could put Tolkien and Lewis into the category of those who saw something, saw the deep roots of the nature of the lie, the abuse of power, single persons who claim all power and use it to deceive others. I mean, it works out. It is what it is that was being written by even these great writers.
Well, that's what we see in the Trump ideology. I mean, those things that you're speaking, I mean, that's what we see. I mean, what's coming, we're not sure, but we know what we've already seen. Well, let's bring Bonhoeffer into the conversation. And that'll really set the table well for round two. So let's bring Bonhoeffer in and let him weigh in. Craig?
It is sometimes said, it used to be said more than these days, Karl Barth does his theology from above, while Dietrich Bonhoeffer does his theology from below. And that I think is a helpful way to begin to see the difference between the two. But it is, as is usually the case with snappy one-liners, grossly oversimplified. Karl Barth does his theology from above. That is true. What that means is Barth finds that every attempt that we make to get to God from what we have figured out and feel comfortable with is going to be idolatry. And so what we have to do if we have any hope of bearing witness to the gospel is to allow our assumptions, our habits, our national and racial identities to fall aside under God's judgment so that we might hear in a moment of unveiling what is radically different from this world as it stands. And so the image in Barth, and this is another thing from his epistle to the Romans, is of a tangent line which touches a circle at only one point. And of course, the mathematical image is that point a part of the circle or a part of the line, or is it both? Or also that God is unveiled? God performs God's own unveiling vertically from above. I mean, this is the image, like as if there were a bombshell going off. Another image he uses for God's revelation in the Epistle to the Romans, a vision of revelation which he never abandons in the dogmatic. But at the same time, this is so crucially important. There is no theologian who is more concerned with concrete life than Barth. Barth is a critic of individualism, but he is a profound believer in the particularity of theology and life. God is revealed in a particular human being, not in like Judaism, not in Western civilization, not in the white race. God is revealed in one particular human being, a Galilean peasant. We bear witness to that revelation, always particularly in our particular situation. Okay, so that's Barth. On the other hand is Bonhoeffer, who is said to have a theology from below. Well, and that is true, but it's true in the sense that, I mean, Bonhoeffer was a Barthian. Bonhoeffer was profoundly influenced by Barth. He was also influenced by Ernst Troeltsch, a liberal theologian. I mean, the word liberal is a technical term. The listeners shouldn't carry to that what they might associate with the word now. But Troeltsch was a magnificent scholar who maintained that we are to understand Christianity in terms of the social sciences largely. So he also influenced Bonhoeffer. But Bonhoeffer was much more a Barthian than a Troeltschian. And when Bonhoeffer speaks of doing theology from below, he still recognizes the otherness of God. It's just that he stresses the fact that we are here on the ground in the midst of a world which is being torn apart. I mean, the hard social, political, economic reality we face all the time is at the heart of his theological work. And so, as I suppose we'll talk about next time, when Bonhoeffer speaks of religionless Christianity, he is both carrying forward Barth's critique of religion, but also giving a certain texture to that critique that is not found in Barth. It may be there implicitly in certain ways, but Bonhoeffer believes with every fiber of his body. We throw ourselves into the maelstrom that is tearing us apart. There is where we're to do theological work. In the sweat and blood and dirt of life.
So one just take off on that. A quick one is in Bonhoeffer's book, Christ the Center. In his opening section, he talks about the logos that people like Hitler and quote unquote contemporary evangelical Christians talk about, Christ and all that as a logos. He says, no, the Jesus of the Bible is the counter logos. He stands against all that human reasoning, all of the attempts at power of using Christianity to gain power, position, to become a kind of silent majority that has this moral compass. He says Jesus stands against all of that. He uses the who question. Our theology has to begin asking with Jesus, who do you say that I am? Well, others say you're, one of the prophets, you're all that. It's like, yeah, but who do you say that I am? That the nature of the particularity of the centering on this person and we're going to listen to him means that all the other opinions that may give power, oh, you're one of the prophets, you have authority, that all of that is called into question. And he questions all of the other questions, the what, when, where, why, how questions, is basically humans using questioning to meet their own ends, So theologically, when did Jesus come? Well, it was long ago. He doesn't speak today. Where is he? Well, he's somewhere. He's not here. We need to run the church to serve his purposes. Why is he doing it? Well, he wants us to be healthy and wealthy and comfortable. And all the questions get answered with these other ones by human agendas of the logos, of the human logos. And the counter logos comes and says, nope, you started in the wrong place. If you don't go with the who question, all of those will go wrong. If you say, who is Jesus here and now? And why are we going to follow him? Well, because he's the Lord of the church, the one church of which Jesus is the head, not the meetings that happen every Sunday, the one church, and we are servants of that one church with Jesus as the head. So why do we do it? Because we're following our head, not because it meets our ecclesial or personal agendas, which, all of these questions ultimately either will be properly aligned with the love of God, the person of Jesus, so that the church gets to do the serving of Jesus, which serves the world, and we wash feet and we meet our marginalized neighbors, as Jesus did with women at the well. And who's my neighbor? Well, that's not the right question. Who was the neighbor is the question. Are you going to be a neighbor or not? And so Jesus realigns us with the who question in Bonhoeffer in a way that just brings a clarity to how all of the outworking then calls into question how we wrongly use the questions, how we can properly realign them, and then we can be the confessing church, which is what, this other standing against Hitler church was called, because they're confessing Christ and following the who question. So Christ the Center is a brilliant place to begin and see the affinity with Bonhoeffer and Barth in this beginning point that then has all of their really wonderful outworkings and critiques.
Of course, I saw the visual resonation for the two of you. It's like, yes, this counter logos. Let's think for a moment. We have Bart who, on that black day, and you articulated it so well, Craig, that he just fell apart. Everything that was his scaffolding and the essence of his theology, and which was in some ways the essence of his person. It's just like decimated. It was in that place that I was making that connection between what you said earlier with the resistance and the resurrection, but it was out of the blood, sweat, and tears. It was just out of all that.
He saw himself as a social democrat. And if you can hear, social is concerned for the whole, and democrat is the role of persons within that. So it's the whole and the particular held together. So he saw that as he was a pastor with the people who were workers in factories, that he couldn't just be somebody theologically separate from that he had to be good for the whole of the people and each particular one of them who he saw sitting there, and he had to speak to them as a social whole democrat. Every individual is valued and the whole is valued. And again, right now we've lost that.
So thank you, Marty. And we have Bonhoeffer leaning into his people, his friends, so he could find a new way forward. Let me ask this. Who are the two of you? What or who do you lean into now? If you're as troubled about what's coming, and troubled from maybe two places, doesn't mean there aren't other places within you, but trouble from a place of what could happen to us in a country that will let the ones that are already oppressed be disposed of, the disposable people groups. And that Trump seems to, even if he were to say, well, I could have a little empathy, but my grand purpose is to get to the end zone. And so anything in my way, it'll be taken out and I'll move forward. So the two of you have devoted your lives to being representatives of God. I mean, that's what you've done. Your career has been about that. I don't know if this is an okay way to frame it. And I love what Craig said earlier. Anytime we say something, it's kind of like the counter to that wouldn't support it. But, God has been your boss. You've worked as a theologian in that space, and Barth worked there, and Bonhoeffer worked there. What do you lean into? What do you listen to? What do you feed yourself with? Other theologians or music or whatever. And maybe don't talk in generalities. What's one thing that you recently have leaned into that somehow stokes the fire within you, that you're not done with your theological work, that your voice matters, and that you can shape things to come? And that's why I invited both of you here, because we ain't playing around here. We're not playing around with, well, it's kind of a theological thing, and isn't it going to be interesting to just critique what's going to happen? I don't sense that with either one of you, and I sure don't feel that. And we are elders, and I don't mean elders of the church per se. I mean, we are elders because of our age.
We're old people.
We're old
I'm
people, but
67. I feel like I'm going on 30 though, so
well, that's fine. But the reality is that young people will look to you if you're saying something that matters to them
yeah.
and represents what they care about. And next time I want to talk to you about the fact, and we'll start with, Trump got 56% of the young vote. 2 years ago, there was kind of this hope among at least whatever progressive means, that there was this progressive wave of young people that were going to vote that definitely wouldn't see voting for Trump. He got 56% of the vote. So many young males voted for Donald Trump, and I want to talk about that next time. But I want to end today with, who inspires you currently? What gives you hope that you will have enough in you, that you will say no, and that you'll resist in a way, and I'm going to use the word faithful, that you will be faithful to the end with representing the God who's been your boss? What do you lean into?
That is, that is a wonderful question. We do lean on one another. And if we don't have someone to lean on, what do we do? And for me, I mentioned at the beginning that I'm an Okie. I'm an Okie by birth and by heritage. Both of my parents were born in Oklahoma. Also, my parents were profoundly, abjectly poor as children. And I was raised by them in a lower middle class, then eventually just a middle class family. And they never stopped reminding me, as my father would say, a man of very few words, Craig, life is just hard. And I remember their example, that they faced difficulties that we have not known, and they persevered. They lived during the time of the rise of the National Socialist Party. They lived during a time of profound economic deprivation, both from families with single mother as head of household. But what I turn to now is for hope is music, largely. There is not a particular figure I look to and think, here is someone I want to be like. I think I've come to terms with my own idiosyncrasy that I'm probably never going to be like anybody, but I find hope in music, and in particular in jazz and in the blues and in spirituals. Right now I have an album on. It's not a great album, but it has two great musicians at the heart of every piece. Came out, I think, 1949, 1950. When I was a little baby, I was born in 1949. And the musicians are Lester Young, known as Prez, and Charlie Parker, known as Bird. And those two figures inspire me in their music. They both had tragic deaths, but I want to tell you, what moves in their music will give us hope if we let it in. And so it seems to me that what we are to do is to recognize the particularity of our theological situation. That's Barth's phrase, theological situation. We are to hope not in what somebody else is doing, although we get all kinds of great insights from that, but to stand up and as clearly as possible to speak that counter word, that counter logos that you mentioned, Marty. The Greek logos is translated as word. It can translate as other things. The word logic comes from it as well. But I mean, think of the prophetic declaration. Hear the word of the Lord. And there is, every time that prophetic word is spoken, there is simultaneously the no and the yes and the no of God. It has a clarity. And the word of the Lord, right now in this situation, I am utterly convinced is that we are to stand and fall with the broken, with the maimed, with the discarded, with the despised, with the ignored, with the rejected, with the defeated. And that means people who are unhoused. That means people who are migrants. That means also the poor whites who are suffering under terrible deprivation. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, I know that parts of that well from being from Kentucky. Marty, you have the last word.
Walter Brueggemann has the prophetic imagination, recognizes Psalms of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And so my work is largely to say we are in times of disorientation, and we can't attack the disorientation. We need to go to the reorientation. So the nature of just saying we need to read the Bible again, but we need to read it not as a place where we go and find arguments to support our agendas. We need to come to hear the living God who calls us to life and love and hope and all those good things. So Brueggemann keeps me in a really big picture of history, not afraid in the moment, but saying there's a big picture here, and we need to stay with that. The one who guides history, you two song, kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, but you go on and on and on. That's October. A simple phrase that I go to quite often as a encouragement. Douglas Campbell, in his work theologically as a Pauline scholar, he was my second doctoral supervisor, but also as somebody who deals with prisons and the nature of injustice in the prison, and just asking, how do we function as those who recognize that Paul was a prisoner, and it gave him a capacity to think about what it means to be both imprisoned but empowered by the Spirit. So to not miss that there may be opportunities in the midst of what may seem like the worst of times, may be the very point where something could be opened up. So there is a hopefulness in the midst of the challenge. The doctrine of redemption is largely what people say is the missing part of the Holy Spirit. And to say the Spirit gives us the discernment to say yes and no. If you really have come to know the Father who creates and covenants and is with us, and the Son who's come to restore us to honesty and to know who we are as those who ever need the grace of God, then in every act of meeting a person, meeting your spouse and saying, what are you saying yes to? And there's a yes to a kiss and there's a no to violence. There is a very act by act yes and no in the daily lived life that the Spirit brings to us. And I'm trying to get to where we think from that truly Spirit-led in the yes and the no of our daily life, where love is what motivates us to act in ways that are true to the nature of the covenant of God, that are true to the nature of the work of the present Jesus, not the somewhere far away Jesus. All the things that you said, Craig, about the people we want to stand against, I have this, concern for the confused and the fooled. And there's so many people who have just bought so many lies. And so I want to become as articulate as possible to say, just a minute here, this thing that came up about, God chose, a man who had a dirty mind and all these things. And oh yeah, that's King David who he put in there. It's like, you've just reduced King David to the level of Trump. You've done nothing to raise Trump's image at all. You're abusing the Bible. Let's just stop and go back and say, let's give integrity to the scripture that we want to stand for. and call out those things that aren't true and say that is not faithful to the life of God. And David repented and confessed and wrote a whole bunch of Psalms that were profoundly acknowledging of his own weakness and the challenge of his times, but always turning with a heart that sought after God. Let's look for that kind of thing. And it's going to start with you. We can't expect these people up high to do it, but if you can begin doing that, you'll be doing what the Bible wants to do. Yes, David's there. Yes, he's human. So are you. So is Trump. Let's move in that direction.
Thank you to the both of you. I have named this the coming onslaught of too many flags. Gabriel Atchison, who is an African-American feminist theologian, she and I did one episode. And when I invited Gabrielle into the conversation, it was 7 weeks prior to the election. And then she tells a story in the podcast about she and her mother driving somewhere around New York City. And if I remember correctly, her mother just said, there's just too many flags. And then Gabrielle talked about what the flag brought up for her mother and brought up for her. And then we named it Too Many Flags. So this was the coming onslaught of too many flags. Guys, thank you. I'm blessed to know both of you. I'm grateful. And I will be back in touch. Thank you.
Thank
you. Bet.